Hi. Hi, everybody. Hi. It's so great to be here. I'm so happy. I love YGLF and I love Israel. I'm from here, of course, but it's always a pleasure to be in front of my friends here at home. We're going to talk about reactive-powered Angular forms, reactive forms, and just a little bit about myself. I'm a cloud advocate at Microsoft, that's me. I'm the founder of NG Girls, and if you're interested in helping out with Angular, NG Girls, diversity, anything, please come and talk to me. Right, so let's start with a demo, first of all, okay? Yeah. Okay, so this is my use case. It's not exactly a real system, it's just a demo for our talk. Maybe you would do this differently, but it's a system for choosing seats in a theater or in the movies or anything. So it's a live form, and you can choose your seats here, okay? And it updates live whether there are seats that are taken by someone else, so you can't choose them. You see that it's disabled. I hope is it big enough? Can you see that? Okay, great. Okay. And some seats also get released by the update because maybe someone canceled or unselected. And sometimes my form doesn't get the update on time, so there's also validation. So if I choose one seat here, so it says, oh no, it's actually has just been taken, so you have to choose a different one. You can see also that there's the number of seats that I chose, and you saw that there's an error message that shows for like 5 seconds or 10 seconds, and then disappears. Okay, so and of course we can save the selection. So what's going on here? Okay, so a little bit about the architecture, the way I chose to do this. Now again, maybe you'll have a different implementation, a different kind of requirements for your seat selecting forms, but this is how I would imagine the perfect system, so like, bear with me. On the client, we know the room ID that we want to select from, and we have it from the router. So we send it to the server to get the room configuration. Okay? So the configuration has the number of seats, the number of rows, the number of seats on every row, and if we have different types of seats, so the different colors are seats that are like for children maybe, or some special super comfy seats, or anything that you want. Okay, and then you also get the live updates, whether it's with a WebSocket or polling. I don't care at the moment, but you get these updates whenever there's a seat that's occupied by someone else. And then when you select a seat, it also sends the async request to the server to ask, is it occupied? Okay, so that's the validation. And in the end, of course, you can save your selection. Okay, so why did I choose to use forms here? First of all, there's user input. So whenever the user interacts with what we have on the screen, I kind of think about forms immediately because it can really help me figure out what to do with the user input, and control it and easily get the value of what the user submitted. Okay, I mentioned there's validation. So the validation that we saw, and also we can have another type of validation, synchronous one. If the user selects seats that aren't adjacent, like leaves a gap, and we don't want that, so we can also do a regular client-side validation on that. So that's very easy with forms. Okay, I want to stop using the mouse. You see that I disable the seats that are already occupied. So, like in forms, we can disable controls. So it's very easy if it's already a form, if it's a form control. I'm getting data from the server, and I can update the form very easily. Angular forms especially give me a very easy option to do that. And we're getting the data from the server when we're building the form. So to build the whole form is we just get data and easily create it, and we easily update the values. And submitting the form is also really seamless. It just holds the data for us with the validation, with everything, with the state that we're interested in, and it just sends the data back to the server. So reactive forms. How reactive actually are the Angular forms? Okay, that's their name, but are they really reactive? And what is actually reactive programming? Okay, we're talking about this a lot, but what is it? So there are many resources and many libraries talking about reactive programming, but they don't really explain what it is. They just give you examples and the API of the library. So I found this one great resource that actually explains what it is. So I really recommend you to read all of it. But in short, it says it has one sentence: reactive programming is programming with asynchronous data streams, meaning that you can look at anything as an asynchronous data stream. You can have a variable and look at the changes in its value as a stream of data, and then react to it, to the changes. Okay? Instead of doing one thing at a time, instead of doing callbacks, it's just a stream. And why do I like using reactive programming in many cases? And especially in Angular with RxJS. We have observables, which are the source that, which is what we're subscribing to, which are actually the streams. So we can have one source of a stream and multiple listeners to this stream, to the changes. And they don't affect one another. So as long as you don't do anything with side effects, you don't care if there's someone else somewhere else listening to the same stream. You just do what you need to do in this point where you're programming it. Okay? So you don't have to be afraid of anything clashes with it. You have a lot of operators that you can use that really help you take a stream and change its value, or maybe change the whole stream to another type of stream, another data input from the server very easily with these operators. And then you actually get a new stream. Okay, so you can change the operators and get this new stream of values, and then act as this was your source, and again have multiple subscribers to that. And once you get to know like around 5 or 10 operators, it's really easy to just deal with any use case that you have. You can combine streams and values. So you have two different streams, and you can actually combine them in different ways, whether merge or filter or just take the most recent value, or combine all the values together. You have all these options of working with different streams, and again, have eventually one stream of the value that you want and subscribe to it. And you can save your resources by closing streams, and you have several ways to do that. You can unsubscribe, and if there are no subscribers to a stream, then it doesn't do anything. You can also say that the stream is completed. So sometimes the stream itself will say, okay, I'm done. There are no more values. And then you don't take up any memory resource for this stream. So these are many advantages over other things that we have, like promises, or even things for regular synchronous programming that I really like to use. But we're dealing a lot with data from the server and also user input, so all of that is asynchronous, and it's really helpful in these cases. So, like I asked, how reactive are the reactive forms? And where can we use observables in reactive forms in Angular? And how can we utilize RxJS in places that are not naturally reactive in these Angular forms? So let's take a look at our use cases. When we get the initial data, it comes from the server. So in Angular, if we're using the HTTP client service, it wraps it in an observable. So we have observable for the initial data, for initializing the form. When we disable the control, again, we get real-time data from the server, again an observable. When we validate the selection, then we send a request to the server, and again, we get back an observable. When there's an error, then errors can also happen asynchronously. And I want to show this error message. So this stream of error messages, it can also be a stream. Okay, that is shown for 5 seconds and then disappears. So maybe there's an event there in the stream. Counting how many seats are selected, we can also do that with observables. And let's see how we actually do this. So initializing the form. So let's talk about the data that we get from the server. So like I said, we have the route params, and that way we can ask the server for more data about our room configuration. Okay, I'm actually creating the form in this case in a service instead of in the component. So it doesn't really matter. And I'm creating the form actually as a stream. So you'll get to see that in a moment. The form itself is an observable. We get it as an event in the observable. So in the constructor, we have the database service, which holds all the methods that we need for going to the server. And we hold the activated route service, which gives us the route params. We fetch the room ID observable by getting the route param map from this service of activated route. Okay? So the router in Angular gives us an observable for that, and we can listen and react to changes of the router params of this ID. So whenever we have a change in the ID, we can get new data. We can tell it to do something. So we have the param map, and we just have to map it to just fetch the room ID only. Maybe we have other parameters there. Then we get the room data. So now we need to switch map, okay? Because before that we just had a value and we had to take something out of this value. So that was a regular map. But now we're switch mapping because we're taking an observable and we're asking for another observable, which is the response from the server about the room configuration. So get room with the ID is what we're doing with the room ID. We're switching the map to get an observable of the configuration. Okay, so now we have the room observable. Now we want to create the form itself. And like I said, the form itself is also, it also comes from an observable that gives us this value of the form. Okay, so we take the room configuration and we map it using a method that I'll show you in a moment that creates the room form. And also another thing, and this is a great example of having two listeners to the same observable, two independent listeners, subscribers. Well, these are not subscriptions, but these are operators that actually take one observable and change it to two different observables that we're going to use. So with the room configuration, one observable is the form and the other one is the room name. So we just map it to just grab the room name from that. So all of these observables. And we can subscribe to each one of them, and if you're working with Angular, you also know that we have the pipes in Angular, the ASYNC pipe that subscribes and unsubscribes and does all the magic for us without having us to deal so much with that. So we can just use the ASYNC pipe to just show the room name on the page. Okay, so how do we actually construct the form? So in my very simple case, let's say that we have the room which is composed of arrays. Each array is for a row. Well, the array holds the rows, and each row is also an array of seat. And we need to know the seat type. And the seat type can be an ID that we map somehow in a different place, and I'm not showing it here. So it's an array of arrays. Okay? So this is the template and the very basic implementation of the seat control. It's oh, what happened there? Oh no! It's a custom control that I made. Okay, because you know that it's not a regular text input or a checkbox or anything, so I created a custom control for the seat. Okay, so it needs to implement the control value accessor so that Angular will know that it's a form control. And then we need to implement write value, which is the method that Angular will call whenever we programmatically write a value to this control. And we don't have to, but in this case, I needed to implement also what happens when this control is disabled. So I'm getting this disabled state, and you see that I updated here in the, so the seat itself is actually a button, and it has a disabled property, and we also changed the class. We add the class of disabled to change the CSS, and the same thing with selected, because when you select, then that's actually the value that we're getting. Okay, so just the basic template and the basic implementation. There's more to that, and in a few days I hope that they will upload the code and you can see that. So how do we create the form with reactive forms in Angular? By the way, who's working with Angular here? Okay, great. So I'm going to go over it really quickly because you probably know this stuff. In Angular, to create a form, you create a form group. And this form group will hold everything that this form may hold, which can be other form groups, form arrays, and form controls, which are the leaf components. So the form groups is composed of the rows, which is a form array that has the rows of the seats. Okay, so I take that. I have the room configuration, and I have the rows in this room, right? So I map it to create from each row a new form array. That's what I'm doing here. And then and how do I create a new form array? I need now, for each seat, I need a form control, right? So I'm mapping the seats array to a new form control, which has all this data. So this is the value when I'm initializing the form control of each seat. It gets a value of this whole object with the row ID, seat type, whether it's selected, and occupied. I'm actually not going to pass to it because this will be controlled by whether it's disabled or not. So I'm choosing here to pass a whole object of values that not all of them are going to be changed by the user. Like row ID and seat type are actually going to be constant. And only selected is what's changed by the user. But I find it very useful to have all this value, all this information in my form control, in the seat, so that whenever anything happens to the seat, maybe I need to validate it or disable it, I have all its data in one place, and I don't have to now merge it to find out what index it is in this form array and then map it to the seat ID or something like that. Okay, I have everything in one place, and that's also one reason why I needed to create a new form control and not just use a checkbox and style it in a different way, because in checkbox you can't have all this as a value. So I find it very useful to do it this way. Okay. So you see that I also can hold this way. I'm not, maybe you're familiar with Form Builder. I'm not using it because this way I have everything here. If I need to hold the value of a control or an array and do something with it, I have it here. So I'm actually holding the seat control so I can do something with it later on. Okay, so how do we disable a seat when it's occupied, when we get the data from the server? So we have several ways to do that. So this is one way that I didn't choose eventually, but it is a legitimate way. If you already have the data about the seats that are occupied when you get the data of the form and when you're building the form, then this might be a good way of doing that. This might be, okay, this, okay. When you're creating the form control, instead of just passing the object of the value, you can pass a value and the disabled state. And then you have to pass an object with the value and disabled, okay? And the value holds the object that we had before and disabled. So two ways of using and initializing the form control. But I don't use that because I have live updates of the occupied seats. So what I do, I have the seats update observable that I have somewhere from the DB service, and I subscribe to it. So whenever I get data, the data that I get is about occupied seats with which is an array of the seats that have a row ID and seat ID, and also the seats that are released because we need to enable them again. Okay, so I'm subscribing to this stream, and I'm taking from this from the event that I get the occupied array, and for each of those, I'm going to the room form. So this is the form that we just created. I'm getting the right seat. So get is a method that Angular gives us to select a specific form control or form group or form array by passing the path to it, because it's nested. So it can get strings, and it can get also the variables that we know their value. Okay, so I know that it's under rows, and I have the row ID. I hope that you can see it well enough. So rows, the row ID, and seat ID. Yeah, it's just directly because an array inside one array. It's a very simple implementation. If you check out the code later on, you'll see that I have also seats string here, because I have additional stuff on this for every seat, for every row. So now I hold this specific control, and now I can just disable it. Okay, so it has the disable method given to us from Angular. Now I'm choosing to not emit the event, because it will, remember that we're counting the seats that are selected. So if it will emit event every time that a seat is enabled or disabled, it will mess up with our count. And I don't want that. So I just wanted to seamlessly disable and not notify anyone about this. And how do I enable control a seat? Exactly the same way. So I'm getting the seats that were released. I'm getting the specific seat and enabling it, again, not emitting a value. So there's also, well, maybe you'll ask me, what about like setting a value or patching a value? Will that help us with disabling the seats? Can we use that? Can we do something like that if we have the seat information, and maybe we do have the we want to disable something when passing the value. So you can't actually do that. So if I'm not clear, that's after you already have the control and you want to set a value later on. You can't do that. This is illegal, okay? When you're setting a value, you have to pass only an object of the value. It doesn't have, like we did in initializing the value, you can't split it to the value and disabled. You only have to pass the value. And what about patch value? Well, patch value is exactly the same as set value when it comes to form controls. So the same thing here. Patch value and set value act a bit differently when you're dealing with form groups or form arrays, but for form controls, they're implemented exactly the same. And what else? What else could we have done? If you do choose to hold the disabled value on the form control, then maybe you do want to use set value or patch value, but then you will have to pass the whole object, which will include also whether it's selected or not. So you're not getting that from the server. Well, maybe you are, but you have to, again, pass the whole object and then subscribe to the value changes observable that we have on each control. And then see if we got the value that it's occupied in this in the new value of the form control of the seat, then disable it, and if not, then enable it. But we kind of do here like too much work, because we also update the form value, the control value, and we then also react to the value and disable or enable that. So the way I did it initially, I'm just using one way and I'm keeping it kind of dry. Okay, validation. So what do we have in validation? Like we saw, we click on a seat, and if it's already taken by someone and it hasn't been updated yet, so it checks and gives us an error from the server, disables it, and also unselects the seat, and also gives us the error message. So I mentioned the synchronous validation of making sure that there are no gaps. So I'll just say something quick about that. Of course, it's a custom validation that you'll have to write yourself. And you can implement it either on a seat or even on a row. So you can implement custom validations on form arrays or on form groups. And then whenever something changes then you can like go over all the values of this array and see, like check whatever you want, okay? And then the error will be on the array itself and not on a single control. Another way of doing that is doing the validation on the seat whenever a seat value changes. And then when you call the validation function, it gives you the control, right? The control with all the state and all the value. And each control also has a pointer to its parent. So you can actually go from the seat to the whole array, the whole row, and check whether the adjacent seats are also occupied or not. This is this, control parent. But going back to the async validation. So we want to disable the seat, to unselect it, to show an error message. So how do we do that? You'll see a lot of validation functions that are actually factory functions. So let's try to do this. Is seat occupied is our validation function. When do we see factory functions? When we need to pass to the validator additional data and not only the control itself. So here I'm passing the room ID, the row ID, and the seat ID, and then I'm checking against the control, whether it's selected or not. And the way that I will register this validation is this way. I'll say that there's async validators and is seat occupied, and pass. I have now, because I just created this seat control, I have all this data, this room ID, the row ID, and the seat ID. Well, the room ID comes from the room information, and then I initialize this validator. I actually create a validator function, so this is a factory function that's doing that. And so let's see how it's implemented really shortly. First of all, it's really, really important to check whether the seat is selected or not, because if it's not selected, we don't need to go to the server and check whether it's taken or not, because it's not interesting. Okay, so this saves a lot of resources for us. But if it is selected, then we're going to this method that we have on the DB service, and again, we get an observable, and then we pipe the response and use the map the map operator to change the value, because in the async validators you need to send whether it's either a null, if it's okay, if it's valid, or an object describing what the error is. Okay? So if you're getting true or false from the server for this method, you need to map it. If it's occupied, then send this error message, error object. And if it's not occupied, then just null and everything okay. Okay? Okay, so here using a factory function, but it's kind of a, not the best idea. Why is that? Because this means that we're creating a new function for every seat control that we have on the form. Okay? New function, each function has a row ID, a different row ID, a different seat ID, and do we really need so many functions? You saw how many seats we have in this room, so do we really need all these functions? So maybe we can use a regular function. How can we do that with observables? Well, we already have the row ID and seat ID, and we have the room ID in our service. So maybe we can utilize that. And how it would look like, it would be just a regular function, regular validation function without the factory function. So I don't know if you can see that, but I crossed out the return the return over there. I crossed out the parameters that it gets, and I also crossed out all this. So it only gets the pointer to the function that we have. Okay, so what do we do? The logic is the same. We check whether it's selected or not, and then we get is it occupied? And so before we needed to say, well, we need to send the room ID and row ID and seat ID to check, right? But we have it on the control. Remember I said that I want to have all the data on the control, on my value. So that's how I use it. So the control itself has the row ID and the seat ID, so I don't have to save it again in this in the validation function. And I'm doing the same thing. I'm mapping the result. And what about the room ID? The room ID, if we have this service that creates this form for us, then the service holds the room ID. But where does it hold it? In the room ID observable. Okay, so this is how I'm using the room ID observable before calling to this method. So I'm first fetching the room ID and then switch mapping it. So I have the latest result and I'm switch mapping it to the method that's checking it with the server and just passing the room ID to it. Okay? Isn't that great? Now we saved a lot of memory for by using observables that already hold the data. Okay, so last thing. Almost last thing. We react on errors. So we show an error message and we need to unselect the seat that was selected that gave us the error. So how do we do that? How do we get an error, know where the error came from, and do something on this specific control? So the thing is, when you get an error on a specific form control, the error is only there. The error will not be on the form itself. It will be only on the form control. Okay? So you can have the form which is invalid or not valid, but you can also have no errors on the form. So the only way to get the error object is to know where it came from, to hold the control. So we need to get the control and with this path to the control like we did before, and then we can get the error object. So, but we don't know which control it came from. Okay, so kind of like, what are we doing here? So what would we do? So where should the logic be? Where do we have the data about which control, which seat the error came from? Where we have the data in the control itself. So we can use the ASYNC validator to also control the error message. Okay. The reason that we need that, of course, and also not only to unselect it and everything, but we also display what seat gave us this error. Okay. So where do we do that? We can do this in the validator, but that will be like side effects of validators. Sometimes you may want to do this, but I didn't want to have side effect in this validator. So you can hold the logic in the service or the component where you created the form. But you can also hold the logic for it in the form control itself, which is what I did. And how do we get the error message? So let's see what we did here. I want to display the errors. I want to control when we see the error. And the error is kind of global on the page. It's not for a specific form control. It will not be next to it. It will be on top. So that's why I'm creating a new behavior subject. I'm actually creating a subject, a stream of events that I'm controlling. Now, for each seat control, when we create it, we have another observable there, status changes, and we can listen to it. So we listen whether it has errors or not, okay? Whether it's, well, the status can be valid, invalid, what else? Dirty, and so like a lot of stuff that we have in the status, but I'm only, I only care about the errors, okay? So let's see, when we get the status, what are the errors? And I want also to have to react only if it's distinct, okay? Because maybe something else changed in the status, but the errors remain the same. So I subscribe to it, and when I get a new error, I pass it to the observable that I created. So I control when we get the error message and what error message we get. Okay? And also I react to it now. If the errors have the seat is taken, then I'm setting the value to not selected, and I'm also disabling it. There's a bit of a problem here. The problem is that that when I do this, when I set the value to selected false, remember that in our validator, if the seat is not selected, then there's no error, right? Because we don't care about it. So we had an error, we reacted on it, we showed the error message, but immediately we change it to be valid. So again, the status changes, and it's distinct, and we then pass to our error subject that, hey, everything is fine now. We pass it the null object. So we don't even get to see the error message. So what do? So we take control over it. So first of all, we want to see only if the status is invalid. Okay? Don't do anything if it's valid. Only if it's invalid, and then I'm telling it to show the error message for 5 seconds, and then I'm passing the null by myself. So whether the user has unselected or whatever happened there, for 5 seconds we show the error message and then it disappears. Okay, so I'm taking I'm in charge of when the error message is displayed. Okay, last thing, really shortly, counting the seats. So again, I'm creating a new subject here that I'm controlling. I'm counting it. And again, whenever the value changes of the seat control, I want to see whether it's selected or not. Okay? If it's selected, then I'm emitting 1. If not, then -1. And then I have another, I'm piping it, I'm using an operator to accumulate. So it's like map and reduce. Thank you, map and reduce. It's like reduce for observables. So you can have, it saves the last value that it had and does something with it, adds to it. So I'm just adding 1 or -1, and the initial value is 0. Okay? So really, again, super easy to control that. And remember how we didn't emit the event? Because if we would emit event, then it would react and it would emit that the value changed for seats that we're not, we don't care about. Okay. But there is one place that we do want to know about this disabling or enabling seat in our async validation. So if the user has selected the seat and we programmatically disable it and unselect it, so we do want to reduce the count. So here we're not, we do emit the event, okay? So just by not passing this configuration, we are emitting an event. Okay, so just a few quick notes to add here. In form controls, we have a method register on change, and one thing that is not very clear sometimes is what changes you register to. So these are changes that only happen with set value, meaning only programmatically changes, not user input. And another method, register on disabled change, it emits an event not only when the disabled state changes, but anytime it is set. So if a control is already disabled, but you're calling again, set disabled, and again, it will emit every time. Okay? So not only when it's changed. So you have to pay attention to that. So in summary, we saw 2 observables that we have in reactive forms in Angular, value changes and status changes of a form control, and we also have them on form group and arrays. Other observables that we used in our demo here is observables that come from the router, the route params, data from the database with HTTP client, async validation that has to return, well, it can return a promise, but we prefer to return an observable of either an object if there's an error or null if not. And another thing that we have to mention here is that when you're using reactive forms and using observables, it's really easy to write unit tests because you have helpers like fake async and set timeout and tick, which really help you there, but these are for another lecture. So thank you very much. I hope you're going to utilize Observables and RxJS a lot more in your project, whether it's Angular or not. And I hope that you got to know a few new things about Angular forms and how reactive they are and what crazy things we can do with them and get some ideas for that. So thanks again for listening. I enjoyed it. Thank you.